The request was small. That was the thing about it. In the context of everything else that was happening, the hospital stays, the medications, the conversations that started with the doctors using words like palliative and comfort care, and the specific clinical vocabulary that families learn against their will in the final chapters, the request was almost embarrassingly small. Not a journey, not a reconciliation, not the resolution of some long-standing wound that needed healing before the end. Just a song, one song, heard live, one time, before it was too late. Eddie Callahan had been a Bruce Springsteen fan since 1975. He was 67 years old, a retired ironworker from a suburb of Philadelphia named Marcus Hook, a man who had spent 40 years working on bridges and high-rises and the kind of infrastructure that holds cities together while remaining invisible to the people those cities belong to. He had the hands of someone who had done that work, large, scarred at the knuckles, permanently darkened in the creases, in the way that hands get when the work gets into them deeply enough. He had been married to the same woman for 41 years. He had 2 sons, both of whom had inherited his stubbornness and neither of whom had inherited his patience, which he considered the relevant trait and they considered a compliment despite the way he said it. The diagnosis had come in the spring, pancreatic cancer, advanced, the kind that announces itself late because it is quiet in its early stages and thorough in its later ones. The doctors have been honest with the family in the way that good doctors are honest, directly, without cruelty, with the specific care of people who have delivered this kind of information before, and understand that the kindest thing is clarity. They said the treatment could extend the timeline and improve the quality of the time that remained, but could not change the fundamental direction of things. Eddie had taken this information and processed it in the way he processed most things, quietly, internally, without external drama, making the necessary adjustments to his understanding of the situation, and then proceeding with the business of living inside it. He had conversations with his wife, Barbara, that she described later as the most honest they had ever had in 4 decades of marriage. He had put his affairs in order with the thoroughness of a man who had spent his career on job sites where thoroughness was the difference between structures that stood and structures that didn't. He had done what needed to be done, and then, about 6 weeks after the diagnosis, he had told his son Michael what he wanted. Michael Callahan was 38 years old. He worked in logistics for a shipping company in Philadelphia, had a wife named Karen, and 2 daughters aged 9 and 6, and had the specific relationship with his father that men of their particular generation and temperament tend to have. Close, in the way that proximity over decades creates closeness. Loving in the way that is expressed through presence and action rather than declaration. And largely uncommunicative about the interior of things in a way that both of them understood was not distance, but simply the dialect they shared. They watched Eagles games together. They fixed things around the house together. They had never once in 38 years told each other directly what they meant to each other, and neither of them had ever considered this a problem because it did not feel like one. Eddie told Michael about the request on a Sunday afternoon in June on the back porch of the house in Marcus Hook, where Michael had grown up. He said it straightforwardly, without preamble. He said there was one thing he wanted before he was done. He said he had been listening to Springsteen since Michael was a baby, had seen him live 4 times, had missed the opportunity to see him on the River Tour in 1980 because of a work conflict that he had regretted for 25 years. He said the song he had always wanted to hear live and never had was The River. He said he understood that it was probably not possible, that concert tickets were not easy to come by and his health made travel complicated, and there were 100 practical reasons why it was an unreasonable thing to want. He said he was telling Michael not as a request, but just because Michael had asked him once, weeks earlier, if there was anything specific he wanted, and this was the honest answer. Michael said okay. He said it in the tone he always used for things he had already decided to do. Flat, quiet, no indication of the scale of what he was committing to. Eddie nodded, and they watched the yard for a while, and then they talked about something else. What Michael did not tell his father was that Springsteen was not currently on tour, that there was no scheduled concert within reasonable distance of Philadelphia, or anywhere Eddie could reach in his condition, that the practical obstacles were not 100, but considerably more, stacked in a configuration that any reasonable person would look at and describe as insurmountable. Michael Callahan was not particularly interested in what a reasonable person would describe. He started the next morning. He spent 3 days researching every channel he could identify for reaching Springsteen's management. Official contact forms, fan organization contacts, charitable Wish Foundation connections, every thread he could find that led toward the possibility of a human being on the other end who might read what he was writing. He wrote 8 different versions of a letter, each one more precise than the last, each one finding a cleaner way to say the essential thing, which was this: his father was dying. His father had one wish. The wish was not complicated or expensive or requiring of anything except a brief moment of someone's time, and he was asking for help. He sent the letter to 11 different addresses. He did not expect a response from any of them. He continued anyway, because continuing was the only option he had decided to allow himself. On the 14th day, his phone rang from a number he didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said she worked with Bruce Springsteen's team. She said the letter had been read. She said she was calling to understand the situation better and asked Michael to tell her about his father. Michael sat in his car in the parking lot of his office building and told her about Eddie Callahan, the ironwork, the 41 years of marriage, the Eagles games, the 4 concerts, the missed River Tour show in 1980, the Sunday afternoon on the back porch, the flatness of his father's voice when he said he understood it was probably not possible. He talked for 20 minutes. The woman on the other end listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said she would be in touch. Michael drove home and told Karen what had happened, and Karen cried, which was the appropriate response. And Michael did not cry because he had not yet allowed himself to believe that the thing was going to happen. And he had learned from his father that the correct approach to uncertain outcomes was to keep working and defer the emotional accounting until the outcome was known. He heard back in 4 days. The details were specific and logistical, and handled with the quiet efficiency of people who knew how to make things happen without making them into productions. There would be no concert. Springsteen was not touring. What there would be instead was something smaller and more direct, which was, Michael understood when he heard it, also something considerably larger. Springsteen would come to Philadelphia, not to a venue, to the house in Marcus Hook on a Saturday afternoon in late August. He asked only that the family be there and that it be kept private, which Michael understood without needing it explained, not because of anything to do with fame or image, but because the thing being offered was a private thing, and private things require private conditions to be what they are supposed to be. Michael told his father on a Thursday evening. He sat across from Eddie at the kitchen table, and he told him plainly and without build-up what was going to happen on Saturday. Eddie Callahan looked at his son for a long moment. He was a man who did not perform emotions and did not have a large vocabulary for them. And what crossed his face in that moment was not something that fit neatly into any category. It was the expression of a man receiving something he had asked for without believing he would receive it. And the dissonance between the asking and the receiving was for a moment visible on his face before he put it back where he kept things. He said, "How did you do that?" Michael said he had written some letters. Eddie nodded. He looked at the table. Then he looked back up at his son and said the thing he had not said in 38 years, in the direct way he had not said it, because the situation had created a condition in which not saying it was no longer an option his body was willing to cooperate with. He said, "I'm proud of you." Michael said he knew. They did not say anything else about it that evening. Saturday arrived with the specific quality of late August days in the Philadelphia area. Hot, but not oppressively so. The light at that particular angle, that late summer light reaches, before the turn toward autumn. The kind of afternoon that is easy to remember, because the quality of it stays with you. Barbara had cleaned the house with the thoroughness of someone preparing for something important. Eddie was in his chair in the living room, dressed in actual clothes rather than the pajamas and loose pants that had become his daily uniform in the past weeks, which Barbara had insisted on and which Eddie had not resisted, which told you something about how he was feeling about the afternoon. The car arrived at 2 o'clock. Bruce Springsteen came through the front door of a house in Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania, carrying an acoustic guitar, accompanied by one person from his team, and he introduced himself to Barbara, and then walked into the living room and introduced himself to Eddie Callahan and shook his hand. And Eddie looked up at him from the chair and said the thing that people say when the famous person is in front of them and the famous person is also just a person, which was simply, "I appreciate you coming." Springsteen sat down in the chair across from Eddie. Michael and Karen and the 2 girls were in the room, and Barbara was in the doorway, and the one team member was somewhere near the front hall. And then there was just the 2 of them, an ironworker from Marcus Hook, who had 40 years of bridges in his hands and a finite number of weeks ahead of him, and a man who had spent his entire career writing about exactly the kind of life Eddie Callahan had lived. They talked for 40 minutes before the guitar came out. Not about music, about work, about what it was like to build things that stood after you were gone, about the specific satisfaction of physical labor that produced visible results, about Marcus Hook and the Philadelphia waterfront and the way the city had changed in the decades they had both been watching it. Springsteen asked questions, and Eddie answered them. And for 40 minutes, Eddie Callahan was not a dying man with a final wish, but simply a man talking to another man about the life he had lived. And the distinction mattered more than anything that came before or after it. Then Springsteen picked up the guitar. He played The River in the living room of a house in Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania, for 6 people and a 67-year-old ironworker in a chair. He played it the way you play a song, when the room is small enough that you can see the face of the person you are playing it for, which is differently from every other way of playing it. The song is about loss and memory, and the specific cruelty of watching something that mattered become something that only used to matter. And in that room, on that afternoon, it was not abstract. It was the exact right song for the exact right moment, and everyone in the room who knew the song understood this. And Eddie Callahan, who had known the song for 23 years, closed his eyes and listened to it being played 8 feet away from him and did not open them until it was finished. When the last chord resolved, the room was quiet. Springsteen looked at Eddie. Eddie opened his eyes. They looked at each other for a moment, and then Eddie said the thing he said, which Michael has repeated once, in a single conversation with a single person, and which is therefore the kind of thing that travels carefully and arrives with its weight intact. He said, "That's exactly what it sounds like in my head. I've been hearing it for 23 years, and that's exactly what it sounds like." Springsteen played 2 more songs. Then he stayed for another hour, sitting in the living room of a house in Marcus Hook, talking to a family about nothing in particular, about the girls' school and Karen's job and the Eagles' prospects for the coming season, which Eddie had opinions about that he delivered with the authority of a man who had been having opinions about the Eagles for 40 years and was not going to let illness interrupt the practice. He left in the late afternoon. He shook Eddie's hand at the door, and Eddie held the handshake a beat longer than handshakes usually last. And nothing was said in that extra beat, but everything was communicated. And then the car was gone, and the family was in the house, and the afternoon was still doing what late August afternoons do in the Philadelphia area. which is hold the light a little longer than you expected to. Eddie Callahan died 11 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, at home, with Barbara beside him. Michael was there. His daughters were there. He had, in the 11 weeks since the Saturday afternoon in August, a quality of time that his family described as different from the weeks before it. Not because the disease had changed or the prognosis had shifted, but because something in Eddie had settled, the way things settle when what needed to happen has happened, and the unfinished business is finished. He had heard the song, live in a room 8 feet away, played by the man who wrote it. He had heard it exactly the way it sounded in his head. Michael Callahan wrote 8 letters to 11 addresses and received 1 phone call, and his father heard his song. That is the whole mechanism of it. There is nothing more complicated than that. A son decided that the word impossible was not a wall, but a door with a combination he hadn't found yet, and he kept trying combinations until one of them worked. The thing that made it work was not the letters themselves, though the letters were good. The thing that made it work was what was in them, which was a son describing his father accurately and completely. The hands, the bridges, the Eagles games, the missed show in 1980, the Sunday afternoon on the back porch, the flatness in the voice when he said he understood it was probably not possible. The truth of a specific person told plainly, without manipulation or performance. The truth was the combination. It is always the combination. If this story stayed with you today, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the word impossible has a door in it. And if you have ever done something for someone that you didn't know how to do until you decided you were going to do it anyway, tell us in the comments.